Welcome to Nuances Beyond First Impressions with the Asian Diaspora. For this final episode of Season 1, we're going to do things a little differently. In our conversation today, Ari and I wanted to reflect about Season 1, everything we've learned, and how it has impacted our lives. We'll also be sharing some comments that you listeners have submitted to us and allowed us to share. For those of you who may not know, Ari and I are both musicians, and I am a music producer. So at the end of this episode, you'll also hear music reels from each of us. Be sure to check the show notes if you want links to stream our music. If you want to work with us, there's also a link to our website where you'll find the full archives, all the definitions, all the show notes, and links to our guests' music. Thank you again for listening.
Throughout the season, we made it a point to highlight our guest stories first. But for this final episode, we thought it would be cool to share a little more about our experience producing this podcast and the impact it has had on us.
The people that I've talked to said that they felt seen just listening to those episodes because they could relate to those stories so much. That was really powerful to me. Just the fact that us putting that out there, other people feel like, oh, this is not just me, that there's other people who have gone through the same thing. And I remember Edmund talking about it in his episode, that he thought he was singular in his feelings and his experiences, but it turns out that's not the case at all, and that a lot of Asian people go through that, and a lot of Asian people are in the LGBTQIA plus community and have the same issues. And personally for me, I did not realize how much of a journey it's been throughout my life, and my relationship with my Asianness has changed over time. I also learned a lot just talking to you, because you and I have so different experience being from different Asian cultures, but also you grew up here where you were almost always the only Asian around, or one of two, whereas for me, even though I was a visible minority, I never was the only one until maybe now. This is all new to me. So it's been a discovery for me. At the same time, it's holy crap, what did I get myself into? I know. Here? But also realizing just how different those things are in different places. I experienced different kinds of racism that you did. I would be walking down the street in Port Louis, and there would be guys who are drunk by the street corner who would have nothing else better to do than to yell ching chong at me and to tell me, don't laugh or you're going to hit a pole because your eyes are going to close, or things like that. But at the time, I didn't actually think that was racist. What I was told by the adults in my life was, these guys, they've got nothing else better to do. Just don't pay attention to them. Don't engage with them. Don't give them any reason to continue harassing you. Just walk past, don't look at them, don't pay attention to it. And I never really thought about it that much. But then I remember a couple years ago when I went back, that happened to me again. When I went to a beach that was a bit more secluded, and it was more like a locals beach only, not as many tourists. And I was the only Chinese Mauritian around on that particular day. And somebody did that. They called me Ching Chong, and they started saying those things. And it made me very uncomfortable in a way that it would not have made me uncomfortable before I had moved here. So my relationship with how I interact with things, how I perceive what is being said to me, has changed based on what I've learned here. It's so nuanced in terms of what racism looks like in different societies. And I feel like we're only scratching the surface. In some ways, it was more racist there because I was like overt racism. But then at the same time, when I was there, I didn't really consider it racism. It didn't affect me. I didn't think about it beyond the 12 seconds that I walked past this person. Whereas now, when it happens to me, I am thinking about it. And it's interesting how much the context can change.
Yeah. For sure. There was a lot of personal growth with my relationship to my Asianness, and I found the past few weeks personally rewarding too. It might have been after Oslin's episode where we had started noticing that our guests were opening up to us about things that they didn't really talk about much before. When they would talk about their experience with being bullied at school for being Asian, or just other experiences when they carried that with them for a really long time, it was weirdly humbling that they felt comfortable enough with us. Some of those people had just met me or just met you, and they were opening up to us about some really personal things. seeing that we've created this space for people to feel safe enough to talk about this was really cool. And I think it was something that we hadn't realized we really needed. When I would talk with Nate or with some of our other guests that I've known, I didn't realize how much there was to get off of our chest that we had never talked about before.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember when we first started the show, I had a really good feeling about it. And I think you did too. We had talked about how something really cool was happening, but I also felt like you and I, we were doing it for slightly different reasons. I feel like for you, because you were the only Asian and you didn't have many Asians to talk about Asian things and you learn about your Asianness, I think a lot of it for you was being able to do that, just finding other Asians to talk to and acknowledging all of those experiences that you've had that you never had the opportunity to be like, yes, this is a thing that we have in common and it's great to get that off our chest. Whereas because I didn't have that per se. I came in mostly because as an immigrant to the US, I noticed a lot of nuances, like how racism is different in Mauritius versus here. When you're in America, you think that it's black and white. This is what racism looks like. This is racist. This is not racist. If you're progressive, you should be doing this and believe in this. And there's a lot of dichotomy. Whereas as an immigrant, I felt like there were more nuances. And I was hoping that through talking with different people, that those would come out. Even between Canada and the US, there are differences between what is politically correct in Canada versus the US. I remember when I moved to the US for work, I had to fill out immigration forms. I was taken aback by the ethnicity boxes that you could check because in Canada, the politically correct way of saying things would have been African Canadian and Caucasian and Asian or whatever. And then when I looked at the US form, it said white, black, Hispanic, other. I don't remember if there was Asian, but I know some forms did not even have Asian. And then the term for me was resident alien. Oh, great. That makes me feel welcome. It was a culture shock. I'm not even in the US yet. I'm just filling out the form and I'm like, whoa, this is different. And I noticed this with our guest as well, where the Canadian guests would rarely ever say white. They would say Caucasian because that's how you're taught to say it in Canada. And the other, for example, is when I moved here, I didn't know that colored was not a good word to use. I never used it, but I just didn't know that it had that connotation. I learned it one time when my sister-in-law had some workers doing some renovation and one of the workers used that word and she was telling us about it and she was like, ugh. So I asked, I was like, can you explain what is that? And she said, explain the whole background. I was like, oh, okay. But we do say people of color though, right? And she's like, yeah, so that's the politically correct term. But if you look at them just from English perspective, colored versus people of color, for someone who is not fluent in English, that's like splitting hair. So as an immigrant who had to learn those things, it gave me a little bit more empathy for people who are outside of our community and just outside of any community that they don't understand, and even just in general woke community. Because I came in as an immigrant, yes, but I am educated. I came from a upper middle class family. I immigrated to Canada. I got a college education. It was easy for me to adapt. But if you think about a lot of the diaspora communities, the ones that are in the lower economic brackets tend to not be as fluent in English. So is it a fair request for us to expect them to know the difference between colored and people of color when they're struggling immigrants trying to survive in America? So I can understand why people like this could end up gravitating towards the right wing, we should be able to say whatever we want. It's just words. So for me, I felt like it was really important to create a space where it was okay to admit that we don't know those words and find a safe space to learn about it. At the same time, you have to think about, let's say, an average family in rural America who's in a not very diverse community. They have struggles. They have everyday things. They're kids. There's always stuff going on in people's lives. And so even though for us, it's like, yeah, you should be an ally. You should be helping us. You should be helping people dismantle the systems of oppression. But how does that work in their context? How do we make that something relatable to them? Because if you've never seen or met an Asian person and you don't know them personally, yeah, you feel bad that there's bad things happening, but it doesn't affect your life. And you got the 2 or 3 jobs that you're doing. You have all these things going on in your life that are higher priority. I feel like there can be a lack of empathy for people who just don't have us on their priority list. If you're privileged, then that's a whole different story. If you're educated, privileged, you have no excuse. But there's also a huge chunk of the population that isn't in that group. And I think that's a huge failing from the Democrats. We're just abandoning those people. I really wanted to try and do something that would be bridging that gap a little bit. I know we can't solve the problem, but if we can add a little bit, have a little space where we acknowledge that you don't know and we acknowledge that it's not your fault that you don't know. But if you listen to those stories, you'll first of all see us as people, because even though they're not Asian and they don't go through the Asian family dynamics, there are still a lot of things that are common with other people. So hopefully people will relate to that and start to see us more as similar to them as opposed to Asians.
Right. Yeah. And that was something we touched on with some of our guests. We talked about that with Nathan. He mentioned something to the effect of, give us an Asian character who's a cowboy or something. Being Asian, it's part of our identity, but it's not our entire identity. And the way we've seen representation, the entire character arc is about their Asianness. And while it's nice to see that acknowledged, it still doesn't quite humanize us because we're not seen with the same complexity as other characters that are developed that are not Asian or that are not BIPOC.
Yeah, it would be nice if being Asian was just like having brown hair.
Exactly.
That's not that big a deal. But unfortunately, it still is a big deal. A lot of people don't really think about that. A lot of the conversations around race in America are focused on black and white, and good reasons for it. The black community has suffered so much, but we don't really hear much about the oppression of Asian people. It's only now that I have started to learn the history. Doing this podcast has actually encouraged me to dig a little bit into the history, which also feels weird to me because in a way I don't feel like I'm Asian American enough, but I felt like it was important for me to learn about the history, what people have gone through from when they started migrating here to now. I didn't know all of the systemic oppression that's been happening, all the laws against Asian people, and everything that's been done on a systematic level, on a government level, to at the same time exploit Asian labor, but also prevent them from thriving too much in American society, but then using them as a model minority, but then not letting them get too far up the ladder. It's just so weird. And I learned Asians are overrepresented both in the lowest economic bracket and the highest economic bracket. There's such diversity. A lot of immigrants, or even people who are here for several generations, are still working class, low income. And then you have people who maybe are like me, are educated, and they come here, they're already educated, they're already debt-free. Then when you look at the statistics and they say Asians don't have a lot of debt in America, well, that's not the whole story because you only let the rich ones come in. So there's a lot going on that most people are not aware of, even Asians. Hearing about all our guest stories inspired me to dig a little bit, and now I'm a little bit more depressed.
Oh my God, story of my life.
But at the same time, I feel hopeful.
Yeah, I think it gets really depressing when you see the news and you see the hate crimes. But then when you personally meet people who really understand, when we talk to Tony and when we talk to Josh and talk to Cece, and they have this understanding of the issues and understanding of what it means to be an ally, that's what gives me hope. Is okay, there's good people here. And if enough good people do the work, then that gives me hope.
Yeah, and Sally's episode also, the thing she said about there is work to be done. You don't have to complete the work, but you also cannot desist from it entirely. That was very powerful because I definitely have times when I feel like the world is going to end.
Just considering everything.
Yeah, even though we touched on a lot of very heavy subjects with our guests, there is hope in each of those episodes. And I felt like it has helped me cope with everything that's been going on. So I hope that it is also helping the people who are listening.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so too. Tony had mentioned something about having these safe spaces where we can vent and be ourselves and then go back out there and continue to do the work. And that's something that I carry with me daily. It's okay. I have these safe spaces where I can talk, I can be completely myself, and people understand my experiences. And then I go back out there to whoever I'm working with and whoever I'm interacting with that doesn't have the same background as me. And that kind of refills my cup a bit. So I really liked that view.
For you and me, this has become that safe space where we refuel.
Yeah. It's been a really cool past few weeks. And when you mentioned you didn't know about the history, and I didn't know, and I grew up in the US, they never taught anything about there's lots of instances of discrimination specifically against Asians and against Filipinos that I had no idea. I didn't know that Filipinos were one of the first Asian groups to settle in Louisiana. And I think even associating my identity with being indigenous was something that I had never ever considered until I started learning more about what being Filipino really means and our history with colonialism and pre-colonial times. So reconnecting and tying my identity to being an indigenous person, even though I probably will never know specifically. I asked my mom, what indigenous groups did we come from? She was like, I have no idea.
There's so many topics that you and I have talked about that we want to mention on the show, but we haven't had the opportunity yet. So I can't wait for season 2, and hopefully there will be more seasons. It's been really interesting. It's been really fun. It's been a lot of work. It has been a lot of work, listeners. We love you.
We do it for you.
We do it for you.
Yeah.
There were definitely days where I was like, is anybody even listening to this thing? I'm spending 20 hours on this episode. But I think that every single time after I put in the work and my eyes are glazing and I'm totally burnt out on it, but then when the final episode is done, I always listen to it when I go to sleep. And every single time when I've listened back to the episode, I was like, yeah, it was worth it.
I was talking to my friend, Morgan, who listens to the podcast. She's a fan. She was telling me, I really like your podcast. When I was talking to her about it, I was like, regardless of what ends up happening with it, if we do 2 seasons, if we do 10, if we do however many, I think I'm just happy with what we put out in the world. And it's going to be there. I think we've put out some really good conversations and we've talked about some important things. It's been really interesting and it's been rewarding.
Yeah, I agree. I'm very happy with what we've put out so far. Yeah, I just hope we can keep up with it. Sometimes I feel pressure because I feel like we had such a great first season and I'm like, can we keep it up? It was so inspiring to me listening to all those conversations and I learned so much and I really want to make sure that we keep that up and that we always bring value to our listeners. Whenever we're editing, we're always trying to make sure that we are providing the best experience possible. So yeah, it's gonna be hard to live up to season 1. I feel like that was such a good season.
It was. I relate it to albums. When you listen to an album, there are filler songs. But this season, there was no filler. Every conversation was good and all of the guests were amazing. Yeah, it was so full.
We have already recorded a bunch of other conversations for season 2, which I'm really excited about, and we have so many more. And even though we've had 12 episodes, we've only just begun to scratch the surface of the Asian diaspora experience. We haven't had anybody from the Korean community, the Japanese community, the Sikh community. There's so many communities that we haven't even touched. And I have reached out to a lot of people. Don't always hear back, but yeah, there's a lot coming in the next season that we have just not had the opportunity to do just because a lot. Yeah, we do put a lot of heart and soul into this.
We're all in. It's so funny though, when you mentioned we haven't had Koreans on the show. One of my friends, he's Korean, and that was his first thing. He was like, oh, these are great guests, but you have no Koreans on the show.
Yeah, so I had reached out to a few people who are Korean and they had said they were interested, but the timing didn't work out for season 1. So we definitely plan on having guests from other communities that were not represented in season 1. But yeah, sometimes it's not just up to us. It's also up to our guests' availability. Yeah. So if you, listener, have somebody in your community or you want to be on our podcast, let us know. Or if there's somebody in your community that you admire that you think would be a great guest, also let us know. And we will try to reach out to them and see if they will come on our show.
Yeah, we try to... I think we had a good broad representation. I'm really glad we had the AAPI and LGBTQ plus representation for the seasons.
During Pride, we really wanted to make sure we had guests from that community because I honestly do not know enough about the community. I learned a lot from our guests, and I'm sure that a lot of people who are in the Asian community are in the same boat. So hopefully that's going to be the opening of the world for people. Because I know people who are listening in Mauritius who know me and are listening to my podcast just because they know me. That's probably not something that they've talked about to other people in the community. That's just not something that's talked about. And I hope that will open up conversations, or at least if there are people that are in the LGBTQ community, but they are not out yet, or they don't feel comfortable coming out, that at least it will help them feel seen and help them feel like they're not alone. All those stories from Cece and Edmund and Tony, hearing how they felt alone because they felt like they weren't understood by their own community and that they couldn't be who they are without clashing with their family or whatever. I think it's important for people to know that they're not alone in that there's other people who have gone through it and who have come out on the other side.
Here are some things our listeners had to say about what they learned from listening to our podcast interviews with the guests we've had this season.
This is Dr. Jennifer from the podcast Generation Jams. I really am enjoying the podcast. I feel like it is so respectful and kind in the presentation of not just the content, but in describing terms at the start. I always come away from an episode feeling like I've learned something and enjoyed the discussion, which is very natural and engaging. So thank you for bringing us nuances.
This next comment is from Dalen Brinkley, my collaborator on our project This Is Fine, as well as a producer and artist for the band Citizen Badger.
Hey guys, thanks so much for doing the podcast. I've been listening for a little while now, and it's been great to learn about folks from different backgrounds, and especially out of the Asian diaspora. I've been learning a lot of cool stuff. The thing that jumps out to me most recently was the episode with Dr. Chung Fat Yim. I thought it was really, really interesting learning how multilingual brains work compared to, monolingual. I am but a simple monolingual man, so I had no idea that, there was the code switching element and the fact you can feel differently speaking different languages. Yeah, I thought it was super, super fascinating. And it gave me definitely a deeper appreciation and understanding for my friends that are multilingual and come from different backgrounds. So thanks for doing that. Thanks for putting everything together, and looking forward to listening to many more episodes in the future.
How's it going, everybody? Ryan Carella from the Break the Business podcast. I wanted to congratulate Sherry-Lynn and Ariadne on wrapping up an incredible first season of Nuances Beyond First Impressions with the Asian Diaspora. I've learned so much from this podcast. It's made me a better ally. So thought-provoking. The show has great discussions of the common threads among the Asian diaspora, but it also opened my eyes to the ways that these cultures can differ. I've learned so much from this show, and I know others have as well. Sherry-Lynn, Ariadne, you guys are amazing. Great creators with a lot of fantastic insight to share. I am so, so happy for both of you, and I can't wait for season 2. Keep it up, guys.
This comment is from Jess Pillay from the Take Back podcast. She's referring to episode 2 with Rahul Borkar. She says, I really loved the conversation about the ethnicity question on forums. That resonated so much because as an Indo-Fijian American myself, I've always felt like I didn't fit in any particular box, and simply checking Asian doesn't feel nuanced enough. I felt so heard and seen hearing you all talk about that. Great interview and episode.
This comment is from one of our listeners, Jay Putty, a music producer and artist. He writes, the one I really enjoyed was the one with Lisa Dene, and the experiences she had being mixed race because it's the little microaggressions and maskings. It really helps open things that myself as a straight white man, I don't really understand. Hearing the things that honestly we need to hear to be more inclusive.
Teacher Jeremy says, the podcast has been so fun to listen to. I'm hearing real-world experiences and opinion in what feels like real time, but I know it's pre-recorded. It makes a big difference to hear the emotion and the context behind what is being said. I also feel like I'm learning a lot. I never feel like the episodes are boring, and I get excited to hear from the next person. Thank you for taking the time to do it.
This comment is from one of our listeners, Kelsey Stokes Roach, a decolonial theory scholar and PhD candidate and educator.
I really made connections with all of them. And you guys have had some amazing guests. I've loved everybody's stories. I really related to Oslin's story about breaking the cycles of abuse, because in so many ways, colonialism is generational abuse passed down to entire people groups. And we see that intergenerational trauma over the years. And part of decoloniality is healing and reconciliation amongst people groups and cultures. How do we do that? What does that look like? Really, again, I connected with so many of the stories. I liked all of the talks about intersectionality as well, that we're just complex human beings with complex thoughts and personalities. And Cece's story, I thought of her bravery. She was talking about coming out and losing pieces of her family and herself and her identity, but also making the transition that she made. She lost all of the privileges she had in the patriarchy. So hearing how she experienced both sides of the patriarchy, but then also how she felt oppression in both sides, is really powerful.
Our listener Masaru says, I've loved the podcast so far. It's wonderful to hear stories from other Asian Americans and to hear what they have to say. It makes me feel less alone. My friend Vivian posted this on her LinkedIn. My former classmate Sherry-Lynn Lee recently started a podcast called Nuances, and it has become something I'm looking forward to every week. I really enjoyed the most recent episode with Tony. Keep up the good work.
This comment is from one of our listeners, Jay Rentz, a music producer and artist.
I was really blown away listening to Tony and you talk about the level of bias and judgment you have run into being Asian in America. I have never lived in a place where there's a very big Asian population at all. I think anytime I've encountered racism or discrimination in my life, it's always had to do with uprooting biases towards Black people. I had a ton of Latino friends, had absolutely no Asian people in my life at all, just because I never lived anywhere where there was really a big Asian population, and then very few Black friends in my life. And so just hearing how much discrimination and how much microaggressions and how much stereotypes you guys run into every day. And I think because of the way I was raised and because of the work that I've been putting in my adulthood to overcome my own bias and uproot my own racism, I just don't think about anything other than black and white, because that's been where the majority of my energy and my observable bias has been. And so hearing you guys talk, it's just like hearing a lot of the Black creators I listen to talk, because it's the same, right? Like, obviously you guys are different cultures. Bias and prejudice and racism looks the same no matter who it's directed towards. It's always very hurtful. It's always super segregating, and it's very excluding and selfish. And so it's wild hearing all you guys talk and thinking about the fact that I've never really thought about how much racism you experience on a daily basis. So that was really sobering to just hear such honest conversation from you guys, and then really confront that within myself and my own thoughts and be like, okay, so where do I have bias in this area? Because this is something I haven't thought a ton about. I'm just very happy to have something to listen to that really is nurturing to the work that I am trying to do in my own life of broadening my perspectives and getting rid of my own biases. It's never anyone's responsibility who comes from a background like you do and comes from a perspective like you do. But I do really think it is beautiful that you guys are allowing other people to hear and see your perspective and be educated in that way. And I really am grateful for that. You guys are doing something that I believe is really valuable, opening people's eyes to different perspectives that they haven't thought about, and from all kinds of people too. I'm really excited to listen to some more. You guys are doing a fantastic job. I would love to share and promote what you guys are doing. I think it's such an amazing and insightful and really beneficial thing.
The next comment is from my husband, George Paolini.
I live in California, and I've always cherished its rich diversity of people from all walks of life. This podcast's interviews with descendants of the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities has given me a new appreciation for the contributions they've made, continue to make, and the challenges they face every day living in the United States.
Thank you again to all of our guests who gave of their time. Thank you to everyone who shared their feedback and gave us permission to share it here. And thank you to everyone who has listened to the podcast. We are so honored to have been given your time, and we hope to see you back for season 2.
Hey guys, this is Ariadne, your co-host. First off, we would like to thank every single one of you who has tuned in. When we started this podcast, we didn't know what to expect, but we have been blown away by the response, and we really feel like this community and this space has become something special. So thank you so much. Even as an AAPI person myself, there was still a lot I learned from listening to our guests. I loved every single one of our conversations. I met such incredible people and learned so much. Tony's concept of calling in versus calling out was huge. I think often there's this perception that if you make one mistake, you'll get canceled, but Tony's approach goes directly against that, and it's an invitation for you to learn and do better, rather than a way to shame someone. Nathan's take on capitalism in today's political climate, and the things religious leaders and political leaders can do to be less polarizing and more uniting, that was such a great conversation. Cece's take on what it means to be an ally, that allyship is a practice and an action, not a label that you give yourself. I loved learning about Edmund's movement, Pride in Every Color, and how even marginalized communities can do better to be more inclusive. How it's important to represent all people within the LGBTQIA+ community and make space for all voices. I also really enjoyed Josh's take on what diversity truly means, and how he's pushing for diversity and inclusion within the beverage industry. How things like the way we talk about different cuisines is reflective of how we treat those cultures and the people in it. I really loved what Sally said about allowing yourself the time and space to rest from doing the work to educate others about your community. That your identity as an Asian American is so much more than that. Oslin's story and her resilience and breaking intergenerational cycles and being an amazing role model for her 2 kids, that was so inspiring. And she's so funny. I think we both laughed and cried during that interview. I loved getting to nerd out and learn about bilingualism and its effects on the brain with Dr. Chung Fat Yim. It's piqued my curiosity, and I can't wait to read more about her research. It was so cool to hear Rahul's story of growing up, his family supporting his music, and feeling connected with his community in Kentucky. Goes to show that the stereotypes don't always apply, that there are Asian families who support their children's careers in the arts from a young age, that there are Southern communities that are accepting and open-minded. And Lisa's story about growing up in a Filipino family was so relatable to me, and it's inspiring to see a fellow Filipino making her way in the music industry. This season has been so rich and full of gems. We hope to see you back here for Season 2 of more nuanced conversations.
Hey there, this is your co-host Sherry-Lynn. We're so grateful for the wonderful guests who gave generously of their time to share their stories. For some, like Oslin, Lisa, Rahul, and Ashley, it was the first time that they ever had the opportunity to open up about their Asian American or Asian Canadian experience, and our show became a safe place to explore that Asian identity. For others, like Tony, Cece, Josh, Edmund, and Sally, it was a platform to articulate the issues near and dear to them and share their hard-earned insights on how to be better allies. I love the diversity our guests brought in terms of the industries they work in, the ethnicities they identify with, the kind of town they grew up in, the communities they're part of. With each story, my understanding of the Asian diaspora experience grew a little more nuanced. My preconceived notions were challenged several times. I also personally learned a lot about the LGBTQIA+ community and how I can better support them. Ari and I poured our hearts and souls into this project, hoping that someone, somewhere, would be touched by it, that they would feel seen, or would see nuances that they hadn't noticed before. But all that would amount to nothing if nobody listened. So thank you for giving meaning to this work that we've been doing. We've received messages from some listeners that we'll be sharing shortly. We thought we were creating a safe space for other people to learn about our community, but it turned out to be a space for us too. To process our common experiences, to know that we aren't singular in our feelings, to realize that each of us as Asian Americans or Asian Canadians can have very different relationships with our Asian culture and how it intersects with other facets of our lives. Ari and I started this podcast because of our common struggles as Asian American artists. But 12 episodes later, I've learned so much about how different our experiences have been in childhood, in college, at work, and even in our enjoyment of Crazy Rich Asians. Fun fact, you'd probably have no idea, but Ari and I have never actually met in person. We had spoken about 3 times before we started this podcast together. And in fact, I don't think we even have each other's phone number. But I think we both had a feeling that we were on the same wavelength and that we would work well together. So thank you, Ari, for co-hosting with me. Here's some music from my duo 23rd Hour, as well as some of my solo projects. If you'd like to hear more, go to SherryLynnLee.com.
De leur velours étoilé, où l'on se rassemble, on rit et on danse et on s'accorde un peu d'insouciance. Jamais, jamais, je ne lasserai de ces nuits d'été où tout est doux comme un bisou donné sur la joue. I'm done trying to figure you out. I've made my peace, 'cause I'm done letting you leave me in pieces again and again.
Dance with me now, here in the snow. I promise it won't be just for show, as the carolers sing.
Come on, let's celebrate, celebrate. Our love's to come, our moments past, yes, celebrate. There is no time like the present, so get a present for memories. So come on, 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 let's celebrate. I cannot fix the world or chase the darkness away, but I can stay here with you until the daylight comes, until the daylight comes.
Hey guys, it's your co-host Ariadne Miller, and this is a reel of my music. If you'd like to check out more, you can search me on any streaming platform you like.
Tell me we will always be like this. Don't let me forget the way you kiss. Baby, hold me like you always will, like you always will, like you always will. And if we could live 1,000 lives, we would find each other every time. I am with you, always by your side. I am yours, you are mine. If I could take it back, I wouldn't change my mind. Drew my line in the sand to leave it all behind. And I don't feel so bad. I used to be so blind. And maybe now I could love without losing myself. But not then. But not then.
One thing is you.
And if there's one thing that I know for sure, if there's one thing in my life that's true, it's that I'd go through hell a billion times just to find you.
And if there's one thing that I'll keep forever, give up everything not to lose. Deep inside my heart of hearts, the one thing